We will now move to the first presentation by Dr. Lenny TEYTELMAN, the CEO and co-founder of Protocols.io. Lenny has over a decade of computational and experimental biology experience. He did his graduate studies at UC Berkeley, and it was his struggle with correcting a published research method as a postdoc at MIT that led him to co-found Protocols.io. Lenny brings to Protocols.io a strong passion for open access, sharing knowledge, and improving research efficiency through technology. His talk is on the selfish reasons for practicing open science. Dr. Lenny, please.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for the invitation. What a pleasure to be here on many levels, not just because it's my only second in-person conference since the pandemic started, but also my PhD training, my co-advisor was the co-founder of Public Library of Science, Mike Eisen. And in 2003, when I joined his lab, all we were talking about was open access. And it's just so amazing to see where we've come and listening to your talk, where we're talking not just about open access to publications, but we're really talking about open research and data and methods and code. We've moved so far beyond the conversations we were having just 20 years ago that in some sense, it's dispiriting how slow change is, and in other ways, it's really remarkable where we are. But I want to follow up on Professor's presentation and really talk about the incentives to the individual researchers of open research while acknowledging very openly, specifically the time commitment and the tension that exists between making your paper, your research output more reproducible and more rigorous, and the time that it takes to do that, right? And everyone is under pressure. And so this is the abstract for my talk, and I passionately believe in open access and open research and the importance of it. And obviously, the COVID pandemic illustrates very strongly the benefits and the importance of this. But again, going back to the individual, how do we find the time and why do we put the time into it, right? And before talking about the time, just a quick heads up, I won't talk about everything, but these are just some of the things at the top of my mind that I wanted to touch on where people sometimes have reservations. Will it hurt my career? Why should I invest in it? And I want to show, as I said in the title, the selfish reasons for some of these things. But before we start on the individual reasons, I want to highlight what I've talked about in the workshop, the Cancer Biology Reproducibility Project, which was an effort from the Center for Open Science and Science Exchange to take 50 cancer biology papers from top journals and just try to independently replicate them. And it's a $1.5 million project that started in 2015. They set out to look at 50 papers. It was so hard to do. They couldn't get the detailed methods. They reached out to the teams that published the paper, and the teams couldn't find the actual protocols. The student has graduated, the postdoc has left. And so even collaborating with individual teams, not just the paper itself didn't have the details, but collaborating with individual teams, they often couldn't find the step-by-step instructions for what they would be replicating. And at the end of the day, they stopped short. And instead of 50 papers, they only did 18, just because of how hard it is to reproduce other people's work and find the details and follow up. And the writing about this in 2017, I think, when the first 5 of these papers came out in the Atlantic, great science writer Ed Young wrote, the hardest part by far was figuring out exactly what the original labs actually did. The papers theoretically ought to provide recipes for doing the same experiments, but often those recipes are incomplete, missing out important steps, details, or ingredients. In some cases, the recipes are not described at all. Researchers simply cite an earlier study that used a similar technique. And as I said, a few years later, they just stopped at 18 out of the 50 papers because it was so hard. And in the summary on the Center for Open Science, they have a summary slide that was 18 papers, and you can see it really is hard to follow up on other people's work, right? 2% had open data. This is a little bit back. They started in 2015, right? So it's state of the art 7 years ago. 70% of the papers required them to ask for key reagents. What are those things? They were not in repositories where you could easily get them. 69% needed a key reagent that the authors were willing to share. That's actually a good thing. 0% of the papers had a completely described protocol, so you had to go to the individual research team. And 1/3 of the time, there was no response from the teams. They weren't cooperating, they weren't providing data, they weren't, actually following up on what theoretically you're supposed to do when you say data or methods available upon request. And 40% were extremely helpful, but even with that, they were helpful, but they couldn't find the methods, right? So again, this was 53 papers, 193 experiments. This is going back to 2015. I think we're better now, but there's still, like you just heard, there's still a natural tension. And talking about the time commitment, here's a survey that Public Library of Science did very recently, and they just posted a preprint on this around method sharing. So this was in collaboration with our protocols.io. And one of the questions, by the way, the slides are available, so you'll be able to get to all of these links. And it's a really fascinating preprint. But one of the questions there was, what is stopping you from sharing methods? And by far, the most common response was, it takes too long to prepare detailed methods information in a way that would be useful for others, right? And this really gets to the core. This gets to the core of the fact that and it's not just for methods, it's for everything, right? If you're sharing code, you need to document, you need to comment, you need to really look through before you make it public. Data needs metadata. There's no way around the fact that reporting, publishing more rigorous, more reproducible science takes more time, right? And this tension, this natural tension that exists, it comes at the expense of the fact that as a student, as a postdoc, you already are overcommitted, you already are super busy. It's hard enough to publish a paper and get an acceptance and prepare your manuscript for submission. So now you're asked to do all these other things on top and to make that paper more rigorous. And the question is, well, where, there isn't extra funding, where do I find the time? Why? We know that it's important for the world and for pandemic response and for climate change. We want science to move as fast as possible. When we're reading a paper, we want all those details there. But when you're the author, what's in it for me and how do I find the time? And so for my talk, I don't want to talk about funders and publishers. I don't want to blame and point fingers at anyone. So everyone in the front row here, you're safe during my talk. But I really do want to highlight some of the hesitations that we have and the particular pragmatic benefits that come with doing more open, speedier science frequently, while acknowledging that, yes, it does take more time. So one simple thing is preprinting. And bioRxiv, medRxiv, physicists have been using arXiv. This doesn't take that much extra time, because if you're going to be publishing and you have your manuscript, submitting a PDF is not days of work. It's fairly straightforward. But one of the hesitations around in biology, physics is far advanced because of arXiv ahead of biologists. But when bioRxiv went live, I think 2013, some of the hesitation was, well, will it hurt me when it comes to publishing? Will people, and even if it's not a problem with journals and they accept my paper, which pretty much all journals now do and promote preprinting, many publishers are progressive and ask you to preprint when you submit a paper. But then there's a question, well, if I do that, okay, it makes it open, I'm sharing earlier, that's good for the world, but is it good for me, right? And one of the concerns that I've heard frequently was, won't people just cite my preprint instead of citing my paper? So then when I'm going out for promotion, I have fewer citations. And what is really interesting is that that's not the case. So here's a slide from an organization that advocates for preprinting, and it summarized the many benefits of preprinting. And one of them you'll notice is increase in citations. And yes, we're open science advocates, so take it with a grain of salt. There might be bias, but with I'm actually not going to play that video. I'll mention it in a second because I wouldn't have time for everything. But when it comes to citations, there is actually a really rigorous analysis of thousands of papers in journals with and without preprints. And surprisingly, what you see is that it actually helps to preprint. So over time, months after publication, in red are citations, average citations to articles that do not have a preprint, and in green, sorry, I didn't make the slides, so it is red and green, unfortunately. Apologies, but this is from this preprint publication, but both of these papers found that there is a pretty strong citation advantage. So if you share preprint, it seems that your paper is actually more likely to be cited faster. And the reasons for this, when you think about it, more people are aware of the work. They've seen it before. There's just more time. You don't have the 1-year delay to publication. So that hesitation, I don't think, if we're scientists and we're looking at evidence, that hesitation, I don't think actually is one you should keep in mind. When you go to the slides, if you have time for a 3-minute video, here's a professor who recorded a video for preprinting, who said that the reason he got his faculty job is because he preprinted, which is pretty interesting case study. And of course, you're very much encouraged to take a look at the link in here. And I think the other thing that I would highlight is that the feedback that you get on preprints, 37% of preprint authors receive feedback. Usually it's by email, not on the preprint live, but that helps you to improve your paper. So if you are practicing open science early and you submit not at the time that you're submitting to a journal, but you submit your preprint earlier, it's an opportunity to get feedback before it goes for peer review and then gets rejected at a selective journal. It's an opportunity to improve your preprint, see what the reviewers are likely to object to, and then submit. Reagent repositories are another thing that is actually a very easy sell if you know about them and you think about them, right? And this is, I'm stealing this from the Public Library of Science page on repositories. And there's a blog post which says, one of the sentences there, repositories like the ones recommended by PLOS handle the logistics of material requests, letting the scientists focus on what's important, doing research, right? Saves authors the time and burden of shipping request materials. So if you're in biomedical sciences and you have plasmids, you have tissues, right? You have things that you can put in a bank, in a repository. This is a slide also that I'm borrowing from another initiative on reproducibility, but frequently, just as people come to you and ask for methods, if people are coming to you 5 years after the work was published and asking for a reagent and it's not in a repository, good luck trying to find it. That's what our -80 freezers often look like. And even if you're there, you're not Federal Express, you're not FedEx. You don't want to be thinking about shipping. You want to be thinking about research, right? So when you use a repository, you send it once. And here are examples of many different field-specific repositories that you use as appropriately, but you send it once, and then it's their headache. When someone requests, you don't have to send the reagent to the researcher across the world. they will handle it for you. So in this case, this is open research that is supposed to save you time. And there's a wonderful page at the nonprofit repository at Chian that talks about saving time, peace of mind. And I like how they say, how many times have you tried in vain to find a plasmid created by a former member of the lab, to remember the cloning sites, or worried about losing your stock from a freezer meltdown? So it also helps you in terms of if there is a failure of your -80 freezer, right? If you can't find it, you at least know that you've put it somewhere where you can access it. And this theme comes up when we talk about data, when we talk about methods. It is a very common theme. When it comes to data, again, acknowledging that it takes time, right? You need to label the fields. You need to say which column is which, right? What is the format? Sharing without adding the metadata to your data is not that useful. Nobody is going to know which file is which, what they're looking at. You need to label, you need to take time. But again, just as with preprints, if you do take the time, there's pretty convincing evidence that papers that are not data available upon requests, but papers that are published with the data sets available in repositories tend to be cited more frequently. And um, you know, I point to these papers, and again, I'm an open access advocate, but I'm actually really careful. Papers that try to argue that if you're publishing open access, you get more citations, that's actually really controversial. And there are many studies that say there is an advantage. There are many studies that say that there isn't. So I never talk about you should do open access because there is citation advantage. That's actually unclear that there is. But with preprints and with the data, it seems to be quite robust and reproducible that if you're publishing papers and your data set is available, your paper will have is more likely to have citations. And I think we can imagine reasons for it, because if someone is going to be following up, reanalyzing, using, looking deeper in and trying to make use of your data, if you've made it available, they're more likely to pick that as a project and then cite your work and build on it. So that kind of makes sense. And in my personal example, I did some quick Perl script analysis when I was still a graduate student in 2007, and recently someone asked me for it. It is, 5 laptops back. I would never be able to find it, but I took 10 minutes to put it up on Figshare at some point many years back. And when they asked me for it, I went to Figshare, I looked for my name. There it is. I sent them the link, right? So it took me 10 minutes. But I have this 15 years later, whereas even if I'm backing up my hard drives, right, I would never find the laptop. It would take me hours to find it on a hard drive, maybe, if I can still read it and can connect it to my Mac, because there's no more USB input on my laptop, right? So these are things that naturally, open science doesn't mean perfect science, right? It means thinking of things that can help you and can help others, and being reasonable. When it comes to repositories, there are many that are fantastic. NTU has actually invested and is quite progressive, and you have a repository. There are generalist ones that you can use for free up to limit, but for sharing public research, the NTU repository, it's on the next slide. I think there is no limit, so take advantage of it. It's the same as putting the plasmid in a freezer. You'll be able to find it, right? You'll be able to come back to it 10 years later. You won't have to dig through and send it by email to someone. And one of the generalist repositories, Zenodo, I think they're funded by CERN, has a wonderful page which says, don't wait until the publication date. So it's just really good suggestion that when you're writing up the paper, you're already doing so much. If that's the point where you also need to put in the protocols and protocols IO and send your reagent and comment your data and put it into a repository, that's a lot of work to do as you're trying to hit submit. So this is just a really good suggestion. If you have data management plans, we'll talk about it a little bit more at the end. If you have data management plans, if you start using these things early on and organizing as you're doing the research, then it's a lot easier to share when you're ready to submit your manuscript. And can I just see a show of hands? How many of you know what pre-registration is? About half. That's great. How many of you have actually submitted something for pre-registration? Whoa, you guys really are progressive. That is fantastic. That is just fantastic to see. For those who don't know, pre-registration is the idea of writing up what you're going to do before you've done it and submitting it to a journal, right? You haven't done any of the work. You don't have the results. No one is evaluating your figures from it. You're submitting the study plan. Okay? And why would you do that? Well, there are some society reasons for why Center for Open Science and many publishers have been promoting it, because it works against the negative results problem, where when we have negative results, we never publish them. They just said, it's the file drawer problem for negative results. It works against hypothesis after results are known, which is a problem in reproducibility and ethical research. But again, going back to, well, why would I do that? Why this is extra time, right? Instead of just doing the work and writing up a paper, I am first writing up my plan, submitting that to a journal, and then I have to have that go through peer review, and then I have to do the work and then write the paper. So this is an extra step, which is true, but it comes with some pretty awesome perks. So if you're doing pre-registration, again, this is from a page at Public Library of Science promoting pre-registration. These are the benefits. But what I've highlighted, you can see in here, submitting your study design to a journal brings 2 additional benefits. Expert peer review feedback to ensure the best possible method and analytical approach, and an editorial decision just on the quality of research you're proposing, right? And so this is kind of amazing. First of all, you're getting peer review before you've done the work, and then it's constructive, right? They're telling you, well, maybe you need higher sample size, maybe you should think of a different statistical or a different design element. And that's coming before you've done the work. Instead of 5 years later, the reviewers are telling you the same thing. And now you have to go back and redo the experiment, so your paper is rejected. So you're getting constructive rather than destructive feedback at the point before you've done the work, where it actually can help you over the next 5 years, right, as you do the research. And the other amazing thing is, if you submit pre-registration, they send it out to review. The journal, if they're accepting it, the journal is committing to publishing your work no matter what the results are. How often do you get a guarantee in life like this, right? So if you get early feedback, you can adjust what you're planning to do. And then regardless of what the science is like, regardless of whether the biology cooperates or not, you have the paper, right? You are not going to be dealing with a rejection. And that's a pretty remarkable thing. And in the last part, because I'm very partial to methods, as a co-founder of protocols.io, as you heard in the introduction, I also want to talk about, and it's very similar themes to what you've heard with data and reagents and preprint sharing. So the mission of protocols is to make it easy to share the details before, during, and after publication. Right? So just as you would be sharing code or data, we are trying to encourage people to share their methods. And there are 2 sides to protocols.io. There is the open access repository, and then there is the private side where you create protocols and you're just collaborating within your team. So we have just over 13,000 public protocols, and it should say over 44,000 private protocols. I don't know why I put in 50,000 there. Silicon Valley entrepreneurs trying to be more optimistic, but that should say 44,000. And again, when it comes to sharing protocols, right, the same thing, it takes time. And we saw in the very beginning the PLOS survey, which said, well, the reason we don't share is because it takes time. And that is very true. But there are some really strong benefits to sharing your methods, not just because it makes paper more reproducible, but when you share in a repository, in the workshop, if you were in the workshop, you will have seen this example. I absolutely love it. If it's not a supplementary protocol to your paper, when you share in a repository, you have beautiful things like this. So this is a conversation on Twitter where a researcher from Chile is asking, does anyone have a method for getting RNA out of primary cortical neuron cultures? You don't have to know what those are. But another scientist from UCSF says, well, from the 5 or 6 on protocols IO, this one should work for you. And why I'm showing this in terms of selfish reasons, what I love about it is if you look at this protocol, it actually is coming from a GigaScience paper on parasites of stickleback fish. It has nothing to do with neuroscience, with cortical neuron cultures. But because you're sharing in a repository rather than a supplement or contact author for details, your protocol is more discoverable, you'll get more credit, it can be used off the shelf, so to speak, right? But it's the same reason why we share code, it's the same reason why we share data, genomic sequences in repositories rather than on lab websites. It's the same reason you want the protein sequences in PDB rather than on your hard drive that you're sending directly to another researcher, like you'd be sending a reagent. So it makes your work more discoverable. And this is a lovely slide that we have from one of the champions, professor in Australia who's using protocols.io. And he recently said that 80% of his recent collaborations have been a direct result of sharing protocols publicly on protocols.io. So if you're doing active method development, sharing early and openly, it can have career benefits, just like that professor who said that sharing a preprint had a very strong benefit. With the new partnership that we have with Public Library of Science that's more recent, not only can you get credit for sharing on protocols.io, but you can easily turn it into a peer-reviewed paper. This is a new article type in PLOS One called Lab Protocols. The protocol is on protocols.io. The paper is in PLOS One. It's a peer-reviewed publication, and here's some of the first authors that have participated in this, and I just love. So this professor said that sharing the protocol, it was then profiled in New York Times. And she said it made me famous in my country, in Latin America. This, he's now a postdoc, but this was his first author paper as a graduate student a year ago. This is a group leader in Germany, and for him, he's an early group leader, and for him, this was his first paper as a senior author, right? And like you heard in the keynote just a moment ago, one of the, if we're talking about incentives and selfish reasons, if you're starting to practice this more rigorous open science now, you're future-proofing your career because funders, countries, government bodies are quickly moving towards, like you heard about the NIH guidelines, UNESCO recommendations in open science. Here are just some examples of funders that require preprints, code, data to be shared openly if you're taking grant funding from them. And if you start proactively, you'll be in a really good position as incentives start to align. And my last slide and the last minute is going back to don't wait for publication date. You've heard about data management plan in the keynote. And if you're starting to do open science at the time of submitting your paper, it's a lot of extra work. But if you write a data management plan, and you start to organize the data, right? If you've been just writing Python scripts on your computer, you're not using GitHub, and then you're trying to put it on GitHub, it's extra work. But if you've been using GitHub throughout your research, if you've been using Protocols.io internally in your team, then it helps you publish, right? It's a click of a button and you have a link to the detailed methods. It helps you write your paper. So if you organize the data, if you think through these things before you start the work, instead of it being a burden, oftentimes it'll save you time and then has all the incentives that we were talking about throughout the presentation. So mention of the data management tool, acknowledgements in terms of people who have peer reviewed this talk and gave me suggestions on ways to improve it. And with that, 29 minutes and 50 seconds, I will stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Lenny. We will now open the floor to 1 or 2 questions. We have 2 mics for you to introduce yourself and to ask a question for Lenny, or you can also post your questions on Slido here by scanning the QR code on the screen.
And I'll be here the whole day, so happy to, of course, engage.
Hey, Lenny, we have one question on the Slido. Would sharing data, methods, etc., make us lose our competitive advantage? Is there a way to protect the interest of the authors?
Yeah, I think it's a really legitimate question. It's a natural worry, but that's what I was hoping to illustrate, that there will be some fraction of the time that being open, sharing a preprint will have someone else rush and try to outcompete you. There's some time that you share protocol and someone else will use it and will get papers. But on the flip side, you share preprint, people know that you're doing the work. They might collaborate with you and co-publish. There's so many, I think, instances where we know horror stories, but if you think quantitatively, there are benefits to being open, right? Where people, instead of scooping you accidentally, know that you're doing this work and will co-publish or will collaborate with you. You share protocols, and like that slide I showed where it leads to collaboration. So a lot of the times sharing preprints, sharing your work brings collaborations and can have, I don't have a quantitative answer to that, but I think we often think about, well, will it hurt me? But as scientists, we should also be thinking, well, what % of the time will it prevent scooping? What % of the time will it further my career and actually help me get work done and help more papers publish? That's not an analysis or research that anyone has done because it's so hard to do a controlled experiment for those who share versus those who don't. But there are many anecdotal examples of where being open about your work helps you rather than hurts you. And there can be a flip side too, but if 10% of the time it hurts you and 90% of the time it helps you, as a scientist, you should make a bet on the 90% time. And I am an advocate for open research, so obviously I have a perspective that is quite biased.
Thank you, Lenny, for the very interesting presentation and your